Matt, what are you wearing? Nobody can see you.
Oh yeah, I should have said that.
Unless you're watching this on YouTube. What are you wearing?
I wanted to get in character, so I went on Amazon and I bought the full garb of a Continental soldier, and I'm rocking it with the wig and everything.
It looks great. Yeah. I kind of feel
Thank
left
you.
out, but I feel like we take this seriously. This is what we do at Backtest.
That's right. That's right. It's part of the
Ready to
research. Let's do it.
Welcome to a special edition episode, or 9th episode of Season 2 of Backtest, the podcast about defining moments in market history and their timeless lessons. I'm Daniel Gamboa.
I'm Matt Harris.
And we are your hosts.
Before we dive in, a quick reminder that this show is for informational purposes only, and it is not investment advice. Daniel and I may have investments in the companies discussed.
So why is this a special episode, you might ask? Well, we in the United States are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. We are dropping this episode just a couple of days before July 4th. And you think you know the story of the revolution, right? Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas Day, Jefferson dropping brilliant prose with a quill, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Listeners, if you think you know the story, think again. The myth of the revolution is incredible. It's inspired so much in world history, and rightly so. But the reality of the revolution is not just fascinating. It's an incredible source of lessons across economics, human psychology, operational execution, and yes, of course, markets and finance.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely wasn't expecting to uncover new things in this story, given how many times we were taught the story of the American Revolution at school. But we never really covered it from this angle, right? Like today's episode is about how the American Revolution was financed. I've never heard anybody talk about that before, actually. Most of us have studied the battles of the revolution and some of the core principles like no taxation without representation. It's easy to romanticize the battlefield heroism and the poetic ideals. That's all ingrained in our mental model of the revolution, but that's really incomplete based on this story.
Yeah. And the core question that we're going to ask today is a twist on the same question Lin-Manuel Miranda asks in the musical Hamilton. So, of course, this being a special edition episode, we had to introduce the story in a special way. Matt, you ready?
Let's do it.
Give me a beat.
How does a ragtag volunteer army in need of a shower somehow defeat a global superpower? How do we emerge victorious from the quagmire? Leave the battlefield waving Betsy Ross's flag higher? Yo, turns out we have a secret weapon. An immigrant you don't know who's unafraid to step in. He's constantly financing, procuring and trading, a real merchant. Everyone give it up for America's forgotten servant, Bob Morris! Bob Morris! Bob Morris!
All right, now I'm ready to start.
I don't think I've ever heard a song that's more appropriate for an AI dance video.
We'll make one. All right, Matt, I was shocked that somehow Robert Morris has been completely de-emphasized from the founding story, given how critical he was to it all. In fact, he's only one of two, to have signed all three founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, it's wild that nobody, including me, had ever heard of this guy.
Yeah, same here. And I want to set us up with this comment that Robert Morris makes in 1781, 5 years into a brutal war, writing to this world-renowned French minister of finance at the time, Jacques Necker. And he says, "You will observe, sir, that we set out in this war without arms, ammunition, clothing, or stores of any kind, without money or credit, that despising the practices of the most experienced nations, we determined to pursue the purest principles of economy in our own way, until we have, by dear-bought experience, learned that we knew almost nothing about the matter." Now, Matt, I couldn't bring myself to give him anything but an American accent since he's about to go fight the British. But, and I'm sure somebody will call me out on social media for that. But that last line is worth repeating, I think. He says, "We have by dear-bought experience learned that we knew almost nothing about the matter." The matter being, of course, the principles of economics. So today, we're telling the story of how the American Revolution was financed, how it was almost lost from underestimating the importance of finance, and how one guy, a guy who our generation has mostly forgotten, Robert Morris, was at the center of it all, not only financing and procuring resources for the war, but most importantly, George Washington was the most important military leader for the Americas. Robert Morris was the operational backbone without whom Washington's army would have probably collapsed from a lack of funding and supplies. But before we dive in, this is the perfect time to thank our presenting sponsor, EQT Corporation.
At Backtest, we study market cycles because patterns from history rhyme. 250 years ago, the United States was founded on the principle of independence, of self-determination.
That's right. And an abundance of energy is a huge part of solving the big challenges of our age, and EQT is leading the charge on that.
Today, the United States leads the world in energy production, providing affordable, reliable energy and helping America continue to uphold the core principles of the revolution: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for billions of people around the world.
All right, Matt, drop us into the colonial economy.
Picture yourself as a farmer in Pennsylvania in the 1750s.
I'm there.
You've got a few hundred acres, a growing family, and land all around you that nobody's cleared yet. And your whole world is agriculture, right? Something like 95% of the colonial economy is farming. But for years now, you just can't get enough gold or silver at the right times to grow or even really maintain your farm.
You had me until the not enough gold there. Big farm, you got a growing family, land all around you. You can see anybody. It's like that's the dream.
And your friend Tench, right, which is a real name that was pretty common back then that I actually liked.
That guy.
Yeah, your friend Tench across the way, he's got the same problem. Everybody in the colonies has this problem. Your town is growing fast, the colonies are growing fast, and all this growth needs money. And you just can't build your farm or open a new town on a tiny, shrinking pile of silver that never seems to be there at the time when you need it. So you look around, and you're like, hey, we don't have much silver, but there's a lot of land here. So what the colonies do is they set up these things called land banks, and these are run by the legislatures, right? These are government-run land banks. And the legislature used these land banks to print paper money, and they lend it out to farmers like you and Tench with your land as collateral. So you walk into a land bank, and you borrow that land bank's paper money that they made up. You borrow that at 5% interest, and you use it to buy some seed and feed your family. And you pay it back over a few years as you sell your crops. And the only reason that paper money is worth anything is that the legislature of your colony has made it what's called legal tender, which means that the man selling you the seed actually has to accept it. And then he can turn around and he can use it to pay his rent or buy supplies or pay his colonial taxes. And they all have to accept it too because it's legal tender. And this system actually worked pretty well. It kept taxes low. The colonies used the interest from their land bank loans to fund the government.
Sounds like Texas.
Actually, Pennsylvania went more than 25 years without a direct tax because of this system. It was a practical financial system that was really well adapted to the farming economy that had tons of land, but just not a lot of gold and silver. And it worked well as long as the colonial governments kept taxes very low and the land banks didn't print too much money, which really meant that every time a land bank created new currency to lend out, it always came alongside a credible plan to eventually pull that currency out of circulation through things like taxes and repayment of loans.
That's a great mental picture for what this looked like. So imagine in that world you just described, right? Like the lots of land, merchants trading, not enough money, low taxes. Robert Morris is going to thrive in that world. So let's talk a little bit about Robert. He's actually born in Liverpool in January 1734. He's born out of wedlock. His mother is not in the picture. His dad, the senior Robert Morris, had left to settle in Maryland as a tobacco trader. So it's up to Robert's grandmother to raise him back in Liverpool. Then when he turns 13, his dad sends for him, brings him to America. He lands in Maryland. A year or two later, he gets sent to Philadelphia, which is the center of commercial activity in the colonies at this time. And Robert apprentices with a merchant named Charles Willing, and he starts doing menial stuff like sweeping floors and sorting cargo and learning how trading works. And in 1750, his dad goes to a party celebrating the safe arrival of one of his ships, right? He's a tobacco trader. Apparently he had a dream right before this that he would be killed by cannons. And so he tells the captain not to fire the salute because he's worried that this dream is going to come true. But in the chaos of the party, ironically, the order doesn't actually go through. And as the senior Robert Morris is rowing out, the crew does fire the cannon in his honor, and they're just firing cloth wadding, right? This is not a cannonball. The wadding actually catches the senior Robert Morris's arm and breaks it. And the wound gets infected, and 3 days later, he passed away.
Yeah, I read a little bit about this, and they called it, they said Robert Morris's dad died in a freak cannon accident, which I kind of laughed. That's a little sad, but I kind of laughed at those aren't really a thing anymore, the freak cannon accidents.
it might happen to you if you get saluted after your ship comes into town. So Robert is 16, and at that point, he's now an orphan. He's got a small but meaningful inheritance. His dad was a successful trader. And as tragic as all of this sounds, and I'm sure it was pretty tough for him, he's also really sharp. He's really good with numbers, and he's got a natural feel for markets. There's a story that while he's still a teenager, Charles Willing, the guy that owned the firm, the trading firm that he's working on, he's away on business, and Robert hears from an arriving ship captain that flour prices have jumped in Europe. And so Robert quietly goes around and buys up every barrel of flour that he can find in Philadelphia. He leaves the locals scrambling once prices start going higher because there's not enough flour. And the firm, Willing and Company, ships the flour to Europe at a massive profit. He's basically arbitraging here. Super gutsy move, and he crushes it. And so if you think about it, trading in the colonies is really all about managing credit and liquidity. Not that different than today, really. And Robert is getting some early experience with all this. He's tracking several currencies at once, British pounds, French livres, Spanish milled dollars, and the paper money of each colony. And like you said, hard money, silver and gold, are really scarce in the colonies. And the real lifeblood is these things called bills of exchange, which are basically tradable short-term business loans, or like paper IOUs, basically, like drawn against a creditor across the Atlantic. And Robert and Charles's son, Thomas Willing, are helping to juggle all of this work, all these obligations at the same time, using credit to stretch the capital they have. Really, they're leveraging payment obligation timelines and the timing of these cargoes that are going back and forth. They're creating leverage for the trading operation. And mind you, trading was really risky back then. You might lose an entire shipment from a storm to pirates. So this is not for the faint of heart, and a single failure could put you out of business. But Robert is really good at it. And in 1757, after Charles had passed away, Thomas Willing makes Robert a partner at the firm, and they renamed the firm Willing and Morris. And to put a finer point on all this, Robert isn't just smart, he's a pretty resilient risk taker, and he's also great at building relationships. A few years after all this, in 1761, he's on a ship that gets seized by the French during the 7 Years' War, and the 7 Years' War is basically the global war behind the French and Indian War. Anyway, Robert is released, but he ends up stranded, penniless, on a beach in Cuba. And he ends up talking his way home by fixing a stranger's watch and asking him for a ride. So really good at building relationships and kind of talking to people and connecting with people. So fast forward to the early 1700s, on the eve of the American Revolution, Robert is one of the best merchants in the colonies. He lives in Philadelphia, which is the commercial epicenter of the American colonies, and he's becoming really wealthy as a partner at Willing and Morris.
Yeah, so it's hard to overstate the importance of the credit system that was in place to make the early 1700s economies work. Everything was done on credit. An example of how credit was used would be something like a British merchant delivering a bunch of chairs or clothes to a merchant in the colonies on credit, then that credit being paid back after the colonial merchant had sold the chairs or the clothes, right? Pretty simple system. And a lot of this credit system was basically left alone by London for a while, and the colonial economies are growing. They're doing okay. And this is one of the big areas where things start to shift between the colonies and London. Some of this credit system is really just not working perfectly for British merchants. Imagine a merchant in London sells 500 pounds worth of cloth and tools to a merchant in Boston on 1 year's credit. 12 months later, the Boston merchant wants to repay the loan, but instead of sending 500 pounds in British pounds or gold, he actually pays in colonial paper money that his land bank, which the colonial laws say is valid payment, but the London merchant knows those colonial notes have depreciated and are not worth as much as pounds or gold. They're also not that, they're just not very stable, versus pounds and gold are very stable. So the London merchant is getting paid back less than he lent out and just really hates the system. This was happening in almost every single transaction between London and the colonies. So it was a big problem for the London merchants. And they start to lean on Parliament to solve this issue. So this all starts in like a pretty reasonable spot, right? British merchants want their loans paid back in the currency they use to make the loan. So Parliament responds with a couple currency acts in the 1750s and 1760s that eventually made it so that all 13 colonies had to stop declaring the new money their land banks were printing what is called legal tender. And so these currency acts really kind of gutted the land and paper money-based system the colonies had set up for itself. And so the colonies pushed back hard on this. The loudest protests are coming from wealthy merchants from New York and Pennsylvania and Virginia. Ben Franklin is working as a colonial agent in London. He fought these acts really hard. And he later pointed to these restrictions, these currency acts on colonial paper and their money system as really one of the main reasons the colonies were drifting away from Britain.
Yeah. Well, and while all this is playing out too, speaking of merchants, Robert Morris and Thomas Willing try a fix of their own. There's a problem. Let's go solve it. So in 1766, they team up with 7 other leading Philadelphia merchants, and they start issuing their own money, basically private money. And this is open to the public. Anybody can get these. They're payable in British sterling after 9 months, and it pays 5% interest, these notes that they're issuing. The technical details of all this doesn't really matter. The point is that money was a real pain point in the colonies, and the reaction to this private money that Robert Morris puts out is surprising to him and to Thomas Willing. I think he was probably expecting merchants to rally around this cheaper, kind of easier credit solving the money problem, but they don't. They hate it. They're worried that Robert and the small group of issuing merchants are going to use the paper to corner things like the flour market and squeeze everybody else out, which, if you remember from earlier, it's not a stretch for Robert because he did that already. So a bunch of merchants and shopkeepers take out a notice in the Pennsylvania Gazette. They announce they won't accept these notes. And not only that, but there's a group that petitions the Pennsylvania Assembly that the power to issue currency belongs to the legislature and nobody else.
Yeah, there's as you're talking, this has crypto written all over it. Like there's so many things about this that are similar to the way the cryptocurrency world works today.
Yeah. So anyway, this experiment dies a quiet death, but it's a sign of how Robert thinks about financial and commercial problems. He doesn't mind taking matters into his own hands, and he's not going to just throw his hands up in the air and shrug off a problem, which is going to come in handy later during the Revolution.
What's not dead is the anger that's building in the colonies. And at this point, we dive into really what's probably more like popular history, because Parliament's actually going to ease off the currency acts after the colonists complain, and Parliament realizes that the colonies really need this paper money system to be functional at all. But Parliament's going to light a much bigger powder keg when they move to tax the colonies. And this all seemed pretty reasonable from London, right? Even though it's a little short-sighted. Britain had just won the French and Indian War, which was the North American front of a sprawling global war with France. And winning that war had been really brutally expensive for Britain. And they're coming out of this buried in debt. And on top of that, they decide it's a good idea to keep a standing army stationed in America, which is probably a reasonable national security strategy, to put it in modern terms. But this just all costs a fortune to maintain. And so how do you fund that, right? That's a huge question in Britain at the time. British citizens are already amongst the most heavily taxed people in Europe, and they know it. And so London looks at the colonies, which had been mostly left alone up to this point, and they see an untapped source of revenue to deal with all this debt. So the first of these attempts to tax the colonies is the Sugar Act of 1764, where they try to increase the taxes on molasses, and they really crack down hard on any smuggling in molasses. Then comes the big one, the Stamp Act, which puts a fee on anything printed on paper, court documents, deeds, newspapers, almanacs, even playing cards. And that's the one that really lights the fuse, right? This is what sparks the massive backlash.
No taxation without representation.
Yeah, I feel like everyone in America should walk outside and beat your chest and just yell, "No taxation without representation!" And it gets so bad that Parliament actually repeals the Stamp Act. But at the same time, it passes this thing called the Declaratory Act. And I'd never heard of this. And this one kind of pissed me off, although it's perfectly reasonable when you consider what was going on at the time. The Declaratory Act says that Parliament has the right to legislate for the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to assert their authority, right? Which I imagine for anybody arguing against the principle of the tax, who cares that it got repealed, right? Like I said, no taxation without representation. That's what I wanted.
Right. And it gets worse. The Townshend Acts of 1767 tax a bunch of imports like glass, paint, paper, and tea. And then comes the Tea Act in 1733, which actually lowers the price of tea, but it keeps the tax in place.
Yeah, what's the price? I mean, this is the famous one. This leads to the Boston Tea Party, and yet it actually lowered the price of tea. What?
Yeah, it gets people really angry, especially in Massachusetts. And so now things are really escalating because all this feels like an unjustified tantrum to Parliament and the king. And so they hit right back with something called the Intolerable Acts, which went a step further and put Massachusetts government directly under royal control, which this really boils things over. So in the fall of 1774, the colonies decide to get organized in their response to all this, and each colony sends delegates to Philadelphia for the first Continental Congress. And the point is that over the course of the decade, things had gone from benign neglect to Parliament trying to control money, and then Parliament trying to tax the colonies to earn extra revenue. And now it's escalated to direct control by seizing a local government in Massachusetts. So these delegates get together to coordinate a united response.
Yeah, it's important to note too, Matt, that almost no one was advocating for independence at this point.
Right. As mad as everybody is, the First Continental Congress is really about airing grievances and getting organized. It's interesting to put yourself in their shoes. You're not going to just jump to start a civil war and break with the crown immediately. You're going to try to work things out first.
Yeah.
But for better or worse, while most people are hoping for reconciliation, the powder keg that had been forming for a decade finally hits in April 1775 when colonial militias and British troops clash at Lexington and Concord. And it's really this is the first shooting battle of the Revolution. It's really the point of no return for a lot of people. There had been a plan for a second Continental Congress in May of 1775, where the point was for the delegates to just review Parliament's response to their petition from the First Continental Congress. But after Lexington and Concord, just a month earlier, their agenda shifts from effectively a peaceful protest into effectively a wartime government, basically a body to help the colonies coordinate with each other to fight back against the British. And this is the point where we go from a fight about monetary and fiscal policy to a fight about self-determination and independence. And we get Independence Day on July 4th, 1776, when the Second Continental Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence. But now they have this huge problem. Immediately. They need to raise an army to defend themselves from the British, and they somehow have to pay for it. So put yourself in the room of the Second Continental Congress for a minute. You need money for an army. Taxing is out because they have no power to tax anyone.
Yeah, nobody wants to get taxed.
Right. The whole reason this thing started. So the idea that they're going to turn around and put a big tax on everybody to form an army is just not on the table.
No chance.
Borrowing is out. Right? Nobody's lining up to lend a bunch of rebels taking on the most powerful empire on earth.
Yeah, to put it into perspective, right? Britain has hundreds of top-notch ships in their navy. The colonies don't have a navy. And the economic output of the colonies was basically like 5 to 10% of the British Empire. So both militarily and financially, America is a huge underdog in this fight.
And they've got no assets to sell. And so that really only leaves one lever to pull. And it's that they have to print their own money. And remember, this is a very comfortable solution for all of them. They already know this playbook. Every colony had been printing their own paper currency for decades through those land banks. So the delegates know how this works, and Congress invents the Continental Dollar to fund the formation of the Continental Army. In June of 1775, just 2 months after Lexington and Concord, Congress authorizes the first printing of Continental dollars. And by the end of the year, they'd issued around 6 million Continental dollars, mostly to raise and deploy the army. So it'd be natural to ask, especially at this point in history, what backs this currency? Why would people accept it? And the answer is that not much backs the Continental Dollar. What backs it is a promise that years down the line, you can hand it to your state to pay your state taxes, right? And then your state will take that Continental Dollar and send it to Congress to be burned, like in a fire.
This sounds like crypto all over again. Yeah.
And so the first of those dates when you can use your Continental Dollar to pay taxes is 1779, so it's 4 years away from when you first get it. The credibility of this scheme to fund the Continental Army rests on the states voluntarily collecting this through their own taxes and having to raise their taxes over time to do that, and then forwarding those collections to Congress, which, spoiler alert, probably not hard to anticipate. The states are going to be super stretched funding their own militias and just trying to stay alive through this whole thing. So this is a little bit of a house of cards right from the beginning. But this is the first of 3 eras of financing the revolution, and it's the era of the printing press. And this approach holds for a while, but by 1776, not long after this all starts, with the bills piling up and a ragtag army of farmers facing off against the most sophisticated military in the world, the Continental Dollar is going to start to slide.
Yeah, and so the paper money is sliding, and we should back up to the Second Continental Congress in May 1775 because Robert Morris is one of the delegates from Pennsylvania, and he's a pragmatist, right? He's not an idealist. He's a global trader. He's all about markets and shipping and credit, and a lot of the colonial trade runs through the British Empire, and so naturally, he looks at the mobs shouting outside the coffee houses and these radicals from Boston, and all he sees is unnecessary risk and outrage. He doesn't want to tear down the system. He doesn't want a war, and the risk to life that comes with all of this. Lexington and Concord were relatively minor skirmishes in the grand scheme of things relative to the battles that we're about to head into. And in fact, at this point in mid-1775, a lot of merchants, and Pennsylvania in particular, are in the moderate camp. They're still aiming for a reconciliation with Britain. On the other side of that, you have the more radical view, mostly from Massachusetts, with people like Samuel and John Adams. And a few months later, actually, that list is going to include leaders from Philadelphia itself, like Thomas Paine. Robert wants no part of that, right? He sides with the moderates. He's holding out hope for reconciliation. His position here is that he sees himself as an American, and he aligns with the grievances around taxation and governance, but he's hoping the whole thing ends in a peaceful resolution with the colonies still British subjects, right? He's assessing the risk of independence and of all of this, especially to commerce and to life and to property. And he thinks if this turns violent, this is going to get very bad for the colonies.
And while all this is going on, the army still has to be armed because you can't mobilize without physical supplies. You need gunpowder and muskets and bayonets and clothes and food and cool hats like the one I'm wearing. And just think about the logistics of all this, right? The colonies are not set up to fight a war across all the colonies. They have no physical or institutional infrastructure to mobilize for war.
Right. And you got to know, too, that for years, Britain had actually suppressed munitions manufacturing in America, right? You don't want your colonies in your empire to be armed. That's the whole point of an empire. You want to kind of subjugate them. And so there's almost no domestic gunpowder. They have to buy it in Europe and smuggle it past the British Navy. That takes a very particular skill set. You need somebody who understands international shipping, somebody who understands European credit markets, who has trusted relationships across Europe. Most of the delegates in the Continental Congress are lawyers and planners. They've never financed a cargo in their lives, right? And so they turn to the one delegate who has, Robert Morris, and the smuggling architecture Robert builds out is a thing of beauty. He has American ships running the blockade on their way to Europe, where they sell goods for gold and silver and bills of exchange. He sets up agents in European ports to do this, to manage all of this, and to use the money that they make selling those American goods to then buy supplies in Europe and ship them back using false papers. And the reason Robert can do this is that he had already set up this network for his private trading firm, right? And so he has the ships, he has captains, he has credit lines and foreign contacts. All of it is basically his pre-war trading business with Thomas Willing. And part of the reason this all works is that foreign merchants trust Robert Morris to pay them back. Right? Like, he's earned everybody's trust. He's supplying the Continental Army with gunpowder using personal contacts and using his own personal credit because the Continental Congress doesn't have any credit. And so despite Robert's reluctance around independence, he's made chairman of the Secret Committee of Trade in the spring of 1776, which is a clandestine supply operation, almost like a CIA type effort. And he also sits on the Marine Committee, which is basically the precursor to the U.S. Navy. And this is going to set up two of the most dramatic moments in the Revolution, the Declaration of Independence and Washington's crossing of the Delaware on Christmas Day. But before we get there, this is the perfect time to thank our presenting sponsor, EQT Corporation.
When you study the American Revolution, and really when you do anything hard in business or in government, you quickly learn the importance of what it takes to build something from scratch.
Yeah, that's right. Not only that, but what it takes to keep something running and running well. EQT is an exceptional company doing foundational work to deliver affordable energy to Americans and to billions of people across the world.
Being an energy powerhouse allows America to influence the trajectory of the world to align with our founding principles.
Whether it's winning the AI race, empowering people with affordable, reliable, cleaner energy, or providing energy security for our allies, EQT is at the forefront of powering America's next 250 years of growth and opportunity.
An abundance of energy is a huge part of solving the big challenges of our age, and EQT is leading the charge.
To join us and EQT in celebrating America's 250th anniversary, go to eqt.com/community/America-250. Big thanks to EQT for helping us bring you the stories of market history and how they apply today.
Okay, so back to the story. You mentioned Robert was still hoping for reconciliation, even though there was a radical faction advocating for independence at the start of the Second Continental Congress in 1775. And Robert Morris, he's running the Secret Committee of Trade by the spring of 76 and the precursor to the Navy. And all of this is before we formally declare independence, right?
Right. And in fact, even in 1776, Robert is hoping we can patch things up. He's still holding out hope. When independence finally comes to a vote in Congress in the summer of 1776, Robert is part of the Pennsylvania delegation. that actually votes no on independence. He thinks it's premature. He even said so in writing afterwards, that he had consistently opposed the Declaration of Independence because he thought that it created division when he thought that America actually needed unity. And his partner, Thomas Willing, votes no right alongside him. In fact, the two leading moderates in their delegation, Robert and this other guy, John Dickinson, deliberately stay away from the final vote on July 2nd, which helps Pennsylvania swing into the yes column and then clears the way for independence to pass. So Robert helps it pass by stepping aside, but he doesn't vote for it at first. By August 2nd, along with most of the other delegates, Robert does in fact sign the Declaration of Independence, according to one of his biographers, as the most reluctant signer of the 56 delegates.
Did you come across, like, if he was so reluctant, why did he sign?
So yeah, two reasons. Part of it is duty. So he said that every man owes his service to his country in a moment of crisis. And part of it is pragmatic too. So if you think about it, his capital and his whole future are tied to America. And by this point, the break with Britain is kind of inevitable. And so he does end up signing, although we should say that his reluctance to sign the declaration also puts him at odds with the more radical faction of the revolutionary leadership. In fact, there's a moment later where he gets accused of fraud when he's running the secret committee of trade. Somebody says that he loaded a private cargo onto a ship called the Farmer, and then when the British captured it, they say that he doctored the paperwork to stick Congress with the loss. But Robert actually says, no, let me answer your accusation with real documents. And he shows up with the documents. And apparently the whole shipment was actually government business that he had disguised as private business in order to try to run the blockade. And so ultimately he gets cleared by the investigating committee. But, all of this kind of begs the question, which is what we're going to unpack through the rest of the episode. How does the most reluctant signer of the Declaration of Independence become the financier of the revolution? And we're going to get to that in a minute. But before we do that, there's a dramatic moment in December 1776 that Robert Morris plays a critical part in. And by this point, the British have landed a major army in the colonies and they're chasing George Washington around. And the British are bearing down on Philadelphia. Congress flees south to Baltimore. They get out of town. The town is pretty much empty. Robert is effectively running the entire government for 3 months by himself. He is directing fleet operations. He's fielding desperate pleas for money from everywhere and for supplies from George Washington. He's basically doing the work of Congress on his own. And it's here that Robert really shines because by this point, December 1776, the Americans are on the brink of collapse. George Washington had been clobbered in New York. The army is pretty demoralized and they're actually shrinking. People are leaving. And what's more, many of the soldiers' enlistments are set to expire at the end of the year. And so Washington's desperately in need of a decisive victory to prove to his army and really to Congress and to the colonies that are really skeptical that independence is going to work. They maybe think it's a bad idea. He needs to prove that this is viable. And so Washington plans an operation to cross the Delaware on Christmas Day, 1776. And not only is this a huge operation, but it's a really gutsy call because the river is partially frozen and they need supplies and blankets and weapons and wagons, and none of this stuff is easy to get. And who is there, Matt, in Philadelphia to get all this for him?
Bob Morris.
That's right. So he personally helps unload these cargoes and get muskets to the army and blankets and gunpowder and all these things. And remember, the city's pretty much empty. So he commandeers some wagons and then drives them north all the way to Washington, north of Philadelphia on the Delaware. And this ends up helping set up one of the early inflection points of the revolution when Washington's army crosses the Delaware and they surprise the Hessians at Trenton and they win a battle that kind of rekindles everybody's spirits and proves to the army and to the colonies and to the Congress and externally that the Continental Army can fight and they might potentially beat the British.
Right. So Trenton really lifts everybody's spirits. But while the army's starting to win battles, the first era of financing the revolution is really not going great. Remember, the Continental Dollar is the main way that Congress is funding the war at this point. And we're a few years into the war. We're 1779. Printing new Continental Dollars has covered about 3/4 of all congressional war spending at this point. Between 1775 and 1779, over 100 million Continental Dollars have been printed. And the whole structure around the Continental Dollar was breaking down. And so when Congress launches the Continental Dollar in 1775, one Continental Dollar was worth one Spanish silver dollar. By the end of 1778, after years of heavy printing, The Continental Dollar had slid to maybe a sixth or a seventh of a silver dollar. So it's, big depreciation at this point. And then in 1779, the bottom really falls out. The Continental Dollar goes into free fall, crashing down to a couple cents per Spanish silver dollar. And then, towards just 1 penny. This is just textbook wartime hyperinflation. This is the point in history where we get a phrase that we sometimes still use today, which is, that thing's not worth a Continental, right? It's not worth anything.
Yeah, and Matt, worth pointing out that by that point, Robert Morris is watching all of this from the outside because the politics had turned. And by 1779, most of the delegates in the Continental Congress had been replaced by more radical faction, and Robert is out, right? He's serving in the Pennsylvania Assembly, but he's not in the Continental Congress. He's back running his trading firm. And he's been warning pretty much anybody who would listen that you can't print your way through a war, right, without some way to pull the money back like they were doing in the earlier days.
Right. And actually around this same time, General Washington lodges a kind of famous complaint that is taking wagons worth of Continental dollars to buy just basic supplies. But Congress is boxed in, right? It still can't tax. Borrowing at home and abroad is not really working. Congress can send requisitions, which are basically polite requests for the states to chip in by sending Congress money. But the states are broke and in survival mode, and they mostly ignore these requests from Congress. It's important to note that the states are spending about as much as Congress on the war, and so they just don't have any money to send to Congress. And so even as the Continental Dollar is dying, Congress's only real lever to survive just the next few months is to try to save it so that the Continental dollars that it prints or borrows in that year of 1779 can have more purchasing power. So the first move to try to save the Continental Dollar comes in September 1779. Congress decides to stop printing. It caps total emissions at $200 million, and it says that is the end, right? They're not going to print any more after this. The catch is that when they passed this cap in September 1779, there'd already been 160 million Continental dollars that had already been printed, right? So there's almost no room left under the $200 million ceiling, and within a few months, they've reached it, and they can no longer print new Continental dollars. The only way, this is crazy, right? They were funding three-fourths of the war had been funded with the Continental Dollar at this point. And so you're kind of you got to ask, what on earth are they doing here? They're cutting their legs out. And the only way this makes sense to stop issuing the main way you've been financing the war is if you're just in straight up survival mode and you're trying to stretch your last few dollars a little further. There's no other mental model that makes sense in, and that's what was going on. And then in March of 1780 comes an even bigger swing. Congress actually officially devalues the Continental Dollar at 40-1 against silver, which is generous because it's actually trading way below that. And they actually release a brand new currency to take the Continental Dollar's place. And this new money would be issued and backed by the states. A lot of academics call it the Continental State Dollar. It's going to pay 5% interest. And any new issuances of this Continental State Dollar would be split 40% to Congress and 60% to the states. And it's important to note, right? Think about what this revaluation does. At 40-1, it slashes the legal value of all old Continental dollars from about 200 million that had been issued to about 5 million.
Ouch.
Which is, this is essentially a default. Congress is saying most of the money it's issued to finance the Continental Army is now worth nothing. And so in 1779 and 1780, Congress is really maneuvering to try to strengthen the Continental Dollar, to survive a couple more months, to get some more purchasing power from any new issuances that are happening then, any borrowing they're doing. And this all just falls flat on its face and doesn't work at all. And remember, this is not like a sideshow, right? The Continental Dollar is how they funded 3/4 of the war to this point. It's all that they had. And it fails in 1780. And this is where things start to get really ugly with financing the war. With no working money, Congress tries another scheme. They pass this thing called the Specific Supplies Requisition System, where Congress hands each state a very specific shopping list and a very specific quota that says, send us this much beef and this much pork and this much flour and rum and tobacco. Essentially bring the army the things it eats and wears and burns, bring it to a specific place and we'll pick it up. And then we'll sort all this out if we survive the war is kind of the next stage.
Yeah, and the logistics of all this are important, right? Because the colonies are really not well connected at this time. There are some reports that say or suggest that it was easier to go to London on a ship than it is to go from a northern colony to a southern colony. There's no real good roads. Everything turns to mud when it rains. And there's redcoats on the way too. And so the infrastructure is really bad. And somebody like Robert Morris is probably shaking his head, watching this from the sidelines, thinking this is amateur hour. Like, this is clearly not working. This is all going to collapse.
Right. So because of these logistics challenges, Congress's new requisition system goes nowhere. And by 1780, the army in the field is living off of what it can take, what it can confiscate. Actually, about 60% of the congressional budget in 1780 is funded by what's called impressments, which is basically confiscation, where the army takes what it needs from the farms around the fighting in exchange for an IOU.
Like, the whole point of this fight is for self-determination and against taxes. And now you're taking, my own army's taking my stuff.
Yeah, the whole point of this war was don't take my stuff without my consent. And so the leaders of the revolution are really against the ropes on pretty much every front, militarily and politically. And so for 5 years, paper money had carried the war, and now it's worthless. The states won't pay, and 1780 becomes really one of the darkest years of the whole revolution. This isn't just the year that Benedict Arnold switches sides and commits treason. It's not just the year of the Battle of Charleston, right? But also, less known, Congress has completely run out of road. They have no money left.
So remember, Robert had been working inside the Pennsylvania Assembly and running his trading firm for 2 years. He's been out of the Continental Congress now for a couple of years, and he's still contributing by privateering, which is basically running ships to get supplies and doing trade on behalf of the government. He's making money from it on commission, and he's actually one of the wealthiest men in America, but he hasn't been in a leadership continental office for 2 years. Well, that's about to change big time because Congress is desperate. The war is against the ropes, like you said, and Robert is the one guy who everybody looks up to when it comes to finance and the economy.
Yeah, and so, like we've been saying, by 1781, the revolution is falling apart for the colonists, and the soldiers really have it the worst of all. And it's not just about them, too. These guys all have families at home. And on New Year's night of 1781, things take another leg down. They deteriorate even further. 10 regiments of the Pennsylvania line, some of Washington's toughest veterans, they march out of their huts near Morristown, and they head for Philadelphia to put their grievances in front of Congress. They get as far as Princeton before they sit down and negotiate, and they actually win some concessions. General Washington up north on the Hudson, he makes the hard call to just stay out of this. He's afraid that if he marches down, then the mutiny will spread north. But then here's where it takes a dark turn, and this is really kind of strikes at how bad this got. A few weeks later, inspired by what the Pennsylvanians had pulled off, about 200 men of the New Jersey line, they also mutiny at a camp called Pompton. And they start their own march to Congress. And again, this is all about money. They just want to get paid. This time, Washington decides he can't let this become a pattern, or he won't have an army left. And so he takes the opposite approach of what he took against the Pennsylvania line. No negotiations. He sends General Robert Howe with 500 troops and a very blunt written order that says, force their unconditional surrender and execute their leaders. Howe surrounds the New Jersey men at dawn and forces them to surrender. And then he makes the mutineers form a firing squad out of their own ranks and shoot their own sergeants.
Yeah, incredible.
And so that's where the revolution is in early 1781. The Continental Army is putting its own men in front of firing squads just to hold together. And it finally forces Congress to do the one thing it has resisted for 5 long years, to hand real power over the money to a single person. And there's only one obvious guy to take control at this point.
Yep, only one guy, Bob Morris. And this is a major inflection in the revolution too, Matt, because in my mind, faced with impending failure, the politics of the government turn from this idealistic frame to very pragmatic, right? Like, you go from impressments and the confiscations that you mentioned, they're all part of that survival mode. But now you have delegates who are adamantly opposed to any form of centralized power, either capitulating or being gradually replaced by more pragmatic delegates at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, these guys have laid everything on the line, right? It's important to keep in mind that if they lose, they're going to be treated like traitors. So failure is really not an option for the leaders of Congress.
Yeah. So in early 1781, they create a powerful new office. They call it the Superintendent of Finance. Think of it as a combination of a Treasury Secretary and an acting head of government all rolled into one. And there's really only one person for this. On February 20th, Congress elects Robert Morris. But there's a bit of a twist. Robert is reluctant to accept. He doesn't want this. He later says that his role was, quote, unsought, unsolicited, and dangerous to accept, unquote. And that he expects, quote, the resentment of disappointed and designing men. So with that, he has some conditions for Congress. First, he wants to keep his private businesses running while he's in office. The second condition, he demands absolute power to fire anyone in the government. And then he also draws a hard line on the debt, saying he'll take on financing the revolution going forward, but dealing with the past debts will have to wait until after the war. Finally, in May, Congress caves and Robert gets everything he asked for. But if anyone from the radical idealists disliked Robert Morris from being reluctant to sign the Declaration, they really hate him now that he forced them to sacrifice their core virtues in order to survive. Right? And his critics label him what they call a pecuniary dictator, which is a funny way of saying kind of like a finance dictator for the colonies. But to his allies, actually, including George Washington, who's desperate for resources and really on the verge of losing his army, and to Franklin, who's trying to convince the French in Paris to help the Americans, this is a godsend, right? Because that faction of the revolutionary leadership thinks that Robert is the only American capable of fixing this.
Right. So Robert Morris starts as Superintendent of Finance in February 1781. To set the stage on what he's walking into, remember the first era of financing the revolution from 1775 to 1779 ran on printing Continental dollars. The second era in 1780 ran on impressments, basically taking what the army needed and handing over an IOU. The centerpiece of Robert Morris's plan is the Bank of North America, which is the first commercial bank in the country's history. The problem this was solving was that the pipes of the colonial financial system were in complete disarray at this point, so there needed to be a credible way to collect funds and then distribute them to where they needed to be, which, that's what banks do, that's what we think, but this was a really bold idea. The loans that the Bank of North America are going to make in its own currency, right, a lot like the land banks used to do, it's going to get its value from public confidence in the Bank of North America, right, which is really public confidence in Robert Morris at this point. And so at a point in the Revolutionary War where nobody trusts the government anymore, they had lost all confidence, Robert Morris is really going to step into the breach and bring confidence back to the markets with his personal credit. And this is a private bank, right? So the land banks were government-run banks. This is a private bank. But the twist is he can't raise any money for his private bank. He writes to everyone, and no one is willing to subscribe to fund the bank and own some equity in the bank. And so what really gets this bank off the ground is a shipment of a little less than $500,000 in hard silver that arrives in the colonies from France. This money is sent by the French government to the Continental Congress to finance the war, and Robert takes half of it and uses it to purchase a controlling share of the Bank of North America on behalf of the U.S. government and to create the initial deposit base for the Bank of North America. But the French capital is not quite enough, so Robert actually uses his own credibility with counterparties to issue what gets labeled Morris notes, right, which probably looks a lot like the currency you talked about that he created for the international shipments and stuff.
Yeah.
These are short-term notes in denominations from $20 to $100, and they're drawn on him and his cashier, and they're guaranteed by Robert Morris's personal fortune, right? So he creates his own currency to supplement the currency that's being created by the Bank of North America. Robert Morris said, "My personal credit has been substituted for that which the country had lost." And so what he's really saying there is the notes from his bank, they keep the revolution together and they keep the army from breaking apart after what was really a brutal second phase of the revolution getting financed with all the impressments.
Yeah, and it's not like Morris notes become as good as gold, but they were certainly an improvement. And so the second move that he makes when he takes on this office of the Superintendent of Finance is that he's now going to go tackle the operational problem in all of this, right? He's going to fix the broken machinery for getting money out of the states. And for years, they had ignored these requisitions that were coming from Congress, these requests. And even when they helped, even when the states sent anything, they did it by paying their own troops directly or by handing over wagon loads of goods, which kind of left Congress with no real control, no cash, and with the logistical problem of having to get the goods over these bad roads to where they actually needed to go. And so Robert shuts that down. He basically tells the states, we're going to have one common treasury that you're going to pay into, and you're going to pay with money, not goods, because money actually solves the logistical issue that we're running into. And so to collect that money, Robert actually builds a team of federal collection agents And Robert takes charge of collections with these agents, and they also kind of double as his ears on the ground. In fact, some states resent these guys as spies. And actually, in general, the states still don't trust Congress, but they would at least be willing to deal with Robert and his administration just based on the trust and the standing that he had. And for the first time, there's a credible kind of centralized system to get the money to where it actually needs to go.
Yes. So in this third and final era of funding the Revolutionary War, Robert Morris doesn't just start the first commercial bank to kind of get the pipes going. He forms his own currency called Morris notes. He fixes a lot of the operational issues with taxation at the state level and really operationalizes that. The biggest lever that Robert Morris uses to fund the last phase of the revolution is actually foreign loans. Starting in 1781, foreign loans become the single biggest source of money keeping the war alive. The foreign loans are going to be more than half of the money in this third and final phase. And this is where American agents in France really shine, with Benjamin Franklin leading the Americans, lobbying the French court, securing the loans, and managing the bills of exchange that turn these to hard silver that Robert Morris can actually spend on the war. We talked about how crucial the French silver is to launching the Bank of North America and to allowing the bank to take in deposits and lend out notes. What's really crazy about this at the time is that the Bank of North America is issuing notes that are several times the coin that's sitting in its vault.
So you don't have to hold the silver dollar for every note that you put out, right? As long as people trust the bank and they're not all cashing in all at once, you can have more notes circulating than you have silver in the vault. That's basically how banks today work. And so he's basically launching the first real commercial bank in America right when America is in desperate need of money to fund the war. This is like fractional reserve banking, and it's brand new to the colonies.
Yeah, and part of the genius of all this is that most of the French money never crossed the ocean because Robert Morris is structuring these as bills of exchange. He can draw cash in Philadelphia against French funds in American accounts in Paris to be settled months later. And at the time, this is like teleporting the purchasing power of money in Paris straight to a dock in Philadelphia with the bill coming due in about 90 days.
Sounds like stable coins.
Yeah. And at this time, this looked a lot like magic to everybody, right? Robert knows that this is effectively how the Bank of England works, but this is new in the colonies. He's taking scarce French silver and stretching it into a working money supply that far exceeds the value of the French silver. And that's a major turning point in financing the revolution.
Yeah, well, and not only that, but this financing setup created by Robert is also a core part of the major military turning point in the war, the Battle of Yorktown. It's late summer, 1781. George Washington wants to take back New York, but he sees an opening. He sees that British General Cornwallis has moved his army, one of two of the main British armies, into Yorktown on the Virginia coast. Washington, being from Virginia, knows Yorktown really well, and he knows that if he can get his army south fast and trap Cornwallis against the bay with the help of the French General Rochambeau, and if the incoming French fleet commanded by Admiral de Grasse can break through the British ships in the Chesapeake, they can surround Cornwallis and potentially win a decisive battle, maybe the war. But Washington, before doing this, has a huge problem. Once again, same thing. The soldiers have not been paid in over a year, and they're marching hundreds of miles in brutal heat. They're at their breaking point, and if they don't get paid, he might lose them, right? Like they might just go home. So Washington demands, I should say respectfully, but pretty forcefully, that his friend Robert Morris find a way to pay the soldiers. And then before Robert even responds, Washington starts marching south. And so Robert is scrambling. He turns to Rochambeau, who had silver, to fund his French troops. Rochambeau says no at first, but then word comes in that de Grasse has reached the Chesapeake Bay and he has more silver. And so Rochambeau says, fine, I'll lend you some money. He lends Robert Morris 20,000 Spanish silver dollars. And Robert loads these onto kegs, and he rides with it to catch up to Washington's troops to pay them, which actually ends up unblocking the Battle of Yorktown, where, of course, Washington, Rochambeau, and Lafayette are going to go beat Cornwallis with the help of Admiral de Grasse. They're going to force him to surrender. And Yorktown is not quite a checkmate for the war, but it's definitely check. And it's really the beginning of the end of the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, so Cornwallis surrenders in October 1781. And over in London, the news shatters whatever the British had left to keep fighting. And within a couple months, the British government in place collapses and the war is effectively decided. But here's another plot twist. the war ending almost breaks the American project of independence before it even gets going. And again, it's all about taxes and financing, and Robert Morris is right in the middle of it.
Peace is coming, but you can't disband the army until the treaty is signed, and the Treaty of Paris is still 2 years away. Except now that the states expect the peace, the thing that held them together, the fear of losing, is really gone. And so nobody wants to pay for a war that they think they've already won. And the money dries up, and there's still no federal power to tax under the Articles of Confederation. And that last part is really the whole game for Robert Morris. He's been begging Congress for years to give it the power to raise its own revenue. Basically, a simple tax on imports is what he wants. And without it, none of the stuff that he built, the bank, the credit, the loans, none of it's going to work. And so by early 1783, Robert is personally overdrawn in France, and the French have basically told him there's no more money coming, and he's out of rope. And so I'm going to suggest that Robert and the people working on this with him, people like Alexander Hamilton, they start looking at the unpaid army as a bit of a lever to get Congress to agree to their federal tax.
So at this point in the war, the fighting's over, and General Washington has his soldiers camped in a town called Newburgh, which is up in the Hudson in New York. And these soldiers are just a powder keg at this point. They've been promised pay and pensions for years, and now they can see that they're going to be asked to disband because peace is coming, which means they might get sent home with nothing. In late December, a delegation from this soldiers in Newburgh rides to Philadelphia, and they lodge a complaint with Congress. And this is not a junior complaint, right? This is led by a major general, Alexander McDougall. And the first name on the petition is Henry Knox, which is George Washington's most trusted general. And the warning they're bringing to Congress is explicit. If the army isn't paid, this petition says any further experiments on their patients may have fatal effects.
Pretty ominous. So they're taking action, right? Like they're not backing down. And so when that delegation reaches Congress, Robert tells the delegates in writing that the soldiers should get no assurances of pay until Congress first establishes permanent revenues. In other words, he's basically saying, we don't have the funds. We can't pay the soldiers until you guys implement this tax. Yeah, so he and his closest ally, this other guy who had worked closely with him, Gouverneur Morris, same last name, but they're not relatives. They see the soldiers' anger as the leverage that they need.
And to be clear, Robert Morris isn't the one egging this on, right? Or at least there's no direct evidence that he was egging this on.
Right, yeah. But Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris work for Robert Morris, so draw your own conclusions. Robert actually threatens to resign unless Congress acts on this tax. He's putting on the pressure, and they're really kind of playing with fire here. And by March of 1783, this anonymous letter starts circulating in Newburgh, urging the officers to defy Congress and maybe even turn their weapons on the government. And this is a real fragile moment in American history. There's a meeting of the officers where they're getting ready to plan their next action and maybe something against Congress. And then Washington shows up unannounced, and he tells them to just be patient, that Congress will come through, and to reject anything that would, quote, overturn the liberties of our country. And so then Washington pauses at this point. He pulls this letter from his pocket, and as he goes to read it, he kind of fumbles around and he reaches for a pair of reading glasses. And then he says, "Gentlemen, you will permit me. I've not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country."
Yeah, I love this speech. I had never heard of this speech that he gave, but it's such a great moment. And I read from a couple sources that some of the toughest officers in the Continental Army are in the room, and they're just all just in tears. They're like all puddles on the ground. They all love George Washington.
Yeah, these guys really respected Washington and really trusted him. And so it's Washington with this gesture that diffuses the crisis. And it's important to know, too, that Hamilton and Robert Morris and this faction pushing for the tax, I think they're also in their own way trying to save the country from financial ruin. And actually, George Washington and Robert Morris continue to be very close friends for the rest of their lives. In fact, fun fact, anyone who's watched the show Hamilton knows that Washington makes Hamilton his Treasury Secretary when he's elected president later on, but he actually asked Robert Morris first. And Robert declines because he wants to go back to private life. But Robert strongly recommends Hamilton, whom, of course, Washington already knew and trusted, and so the rest is history. So, Matt, with that, let's start wrapping up. What is the financial picture at the end of the war, and how does it all get resolved over time?
Yeah, so the Treaty of Paris gets signed on September 3rd, 1783. And this is where Britain recognized the independence of the United States and agrees to withdraw their troops from the US. And pretty much right away, there's a major problem. And it's the problem that Robert Morris has been calling out the whole time. Congress still has no power to tax. And because they have no power to tax, they have no way to pay off their war debt. And the main source of this huge financial problem is rooted in the design of the Articles of Confederation, which is the document that's been governing the colonies up to this point. And the whole point of the Articles of Confederation is actually to have a weak central government. But depending on requisitions from the states, clearly hasn't worked. In fact, Congress received only 10% of the funding it requested from the states from 1781 to 1787. So it's clear to everybody involved that the Articles of Confederation are just not going to cut it. They can't pay their debts under the Articles of Confederation. And the U.S. is just not going to be able to raise any money to build its country. From the outside in, the U.S. looks just like a borrower with tons of debt and no ability to ever earn any income. But there's not really any consensus for how to solve this. By 1786 and leading into 87, on one side you have the anti-federalists, who are opposed to creating a powerful central government with, huge financial powers. They want the national debt for the war to be paid by the states to Congress. On the other side, there's the Federalists, who are aligned with Robert Morris, and they're led by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. And they think the Anti-Federalists are nuts. They're thinking, we already tried this state-centric solution. It didn't work at all, not even a little bit. Financing the revolution was a nightmare. And the Anti-Federalists weren't really presenting a solution to the problem of creating an independent America that could borrow and defend itself and survive. So this all comes to a head at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And at first, everything at the convention is gridlocked because the states don't want to cede power to any of the other states. But that gets resolved with the compromise that leads to two chambers of Congress. And when the Constitution is signed on September 17, 1787, the Federalists, led by Madison and Hamilton, win the day over the Anti-Federalists. And importantly, the Constitution declares that debts incurred before the Constitution remain valid. And the Constitution gives the new federal government the taxing and borrowing powers needed to actually repay those debts. But the Constitution itself is silent on exactly which pre-Constitution debts the federal government will assume and how those debts will be treated. That doesn't get cleared up until the Funding Act of 1790, with Alexander Hamilton serving as the principal architect, where he really fulfills Robert Morris's original vision by pairing taxing power with a large national debt. And so to bring it all back, to review how did all this debt that was incurred to finance the revolution get dealt with? Foreign debt, which was owned primarily by the French and a little bit by the Dutch, was honored according to the original contracts. Federal domestic debt and the outstanding state debt that had been incurred to fund the revolution was also funded at par. And the founding fathers thought the federal government assuming the state debt was really important to having a unified country. And Continental dollars get massively devalued. They can be exchanged 100 Continental dollars for every one Treasury bill in the new federal debt. So with the Constitution and the 1790 Funding Act, the U.S. goes from really close to a bankrupt republic that a lot of people think is not going to survive very long, to really getting its act together, forming a strong central government, honoring its debts just like Robert Morris had advocated for. And so Robert Morris is really such a central figure in all this, right? But he's not I didn't know about him. And so it has me wondering now at the end, close this out, how should we remember Robert Morris?
Yeah, so there's this book I read a few years ago called Founding Brothers, where the author compares George Washington to Cincinnatus. And Cincinnatus is this military leader from ancient Rome that twice gets handed dictatorial powers to raise an army to defend the Roman Republic. And then both times, after he defeats the threat, he willingly hands power back to the Senate and retires to his farm. He's kind of the ancient blueprint for the selfless leader that subordinates military power to civilian rule. That's very much an American principle. And so naturally, George Washington is viewed by a lot of historians as the American Cincinnatus. And I wonder whether Robert Morris fits the Cincinnatus comparison too, in that he served at a personal cost and then returned to private life without really trying to keep or consolidate political power. So what if the way to think about it is that our mental model of Washington has become so mythologized, right? Partly because he was so virtuous in his approach to the war and his rejection of power and his preference for a quiet life, that he's become indistinguishable from the ideal. And it's hard to bring Washington down from that pedestal. He kind of seems superhuman to me. I think the story of Robert Morris also exemplifies the virtues of self-sacrifice and hard work, but his story is much more complicated. In its own way, it's more human, partly because he hasn't been mythologized and partly because it's easier to see the more imperfect parts of his life. I think the tension between self-interest and self-sacrifice, and that you do what you say you're going to do, he's kind of reliable to a fault, which I think is why Washington is a lifelong friend, and so is Franklin, and why he's respected by an entire generation of historical giants, even those who disagree with his politics, so much so that he's one of only 4 people in American history to be handed near dictatorial executive powers. The only other people on that list are George Washington, Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, and Franklin Roosevelt during World War II. And so I'll leave you with this, Matt. Is it a stretch to suggest that we wouldn't have a United States if it hadn't been for Robert Morris? I don't think so.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's the perfect spot to end this one.
Yeah, brilliant story.
Well, listeners, thank you. If you enjoyed this special episode about how the American Revolution was financed, as always, the best way to help us is to share it with anyone you think might like it, and to leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And of course, stay tuned for our next episode. Thanks. See you, Daniel.
See you, Matt.